Welcome to Strength for Today's Pastor, conversations with current senior pastors and leaders which will strengthen and help you in your pastoral ministry. And now, here's your host, Bill Holdridge of Hoyman Ministries.
Welcome to podcast number 85. Today we're going to be talking with a brother in Christ. We're going to call him blogger Jeremy. Jeremy lives in Israel. He is a blogger and a committed follower of Jesus. And he wrote on something that is strengthening me in a blog post entitled, "This is War." And I think it's going to strengthen many pastors and also their congregations. What the blog is about, it's a word from the Lord about how we should live in the light of our current global and local situations as believers. And I found out about this blog through a mutual friend of ours, Pastor Paul from Calvary Chapel, Ontario, Oregon. And I'm not going to be releasing his full name for obvious reasons, but we want to welcome Jeremy to the program. Jeremy, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, I want to just dive right in because the content is so rich. I think we want to really get right to it. Excellent blog post. In the very first paragraph of the article, you wrote, quote, "By now it's clear we are at war, and that 2020 will be remembered as the year in which a fierce spiritual attack was unleashed upon us." Speaking of the attack upon Christians worldwide. "A declaration of war by the enemy leaves us with no choice but to sound the alarm before our King and to enter the battlefield. As you prepare, pay attention to this spiritual briefing." So you called it a spiritual briefing, and you referred to scriptures as the lead into your blog posts in Leviticus, Numbers, 1 Corinthians. So tell us a bit about those passages, Jeremy, and how they relate to your article.
Well, that's really interesting to look at the verses that I mentioned there. They reference the Feast of Trumpets, which incidentally has just concluded last night here in Israel. And it's a very mysterious holy day, a very mysterious feast in the Bible. We have only one real commandment, and that is to blow the trumpet, which we learn from other contexts can often be done in a sense of sounding the battle cry, calling for help. That's one of the reasons that you blow a trumpet. And we also see in 1 Corinthians, the verse that you referenced there, we see there that there is a need for a clarion call, a clear voice, and we need to, once the war has been declared, we need not fear. We need to sound the battle cry. We need to communicate with our king, our captain, our commander, and we need to recognize that we are in an all-out war. That's what we're looking at right now.
So tell me, why do you believe that a declaration of war has been made by the enemy? What makes it a declaration of war? Why do you believe that?
Well, all throughout history, there has been spiritual warfare. This is something we know. We already know that. We know that at any given time, there are people that are going through serious spiritual warfare, and they really need the protection and the boldness of God to get through those situations. However, it was usually on one front or another where there was like some people at one time and then some people at another time. In this case, I think we can quite clearly see that there is an overall out-and-out assault on the entire body of Christ, all believers around the world. And I think that's what we see there going on in the news, in the different things that are going on. We can see, and I think we can all sense as well, that there's a deep, intense spiritual warfare.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, there's a global pandemic and there's global spiritual warfare. So what you've written, you've called a spiritual briefing, and it kind of read to me like a set of instructions that an officer might give to his troops or his Navy or Marines or whatever it might be. And so before I ask you to dive into the particulars of all these things and what they mean, maybe it would be helpful to synopsize the meaning of the 8 major points of the article. You started with victory, and then objectives, and then enemies, and then surprise, and vengeance, and role, and expectations, and identity. These were the 8 major points of the article. Maybe you could summarize those briefly so that we can have context going into the next part of the discussion.
Well, you know, one of the first prophecies in the Bible, with the bruising of the head of the serpent, is the crushing of the head of the serpent is a prophecy of victory even before the time. And we need to come from a perspective in our lives and in this current battle, we need to come with the perspective that the victory has already been decided. We may see battles raging, ongoing. They may get far worse, far more difficult. But if we come to this battlefront with anything less than full conviction that Jesus is the victor and that he ultimately will prevail on every front, in every way, against the enemy, then we will come with an inferiority complex that will greatly affect how we respond to events and how we personally are participating in that victory. This is not just simply hyping ourselves up psychologically. This is connecting deeply with the victory that has already been granted, that we will see in its fruition, in its totality at the end of time. And that is something that needs to guide us in every day that we are fighting, on every front that we are waging war. That needs to guide us.
Oh, that's great. So not only are we fighting with the concept in our minds, this is a great cause. There's no more important battle to wage here or war to fight. But we're also going into it thinking we've already won. It's guaranteed. It's assured. Okay, so then from there you went from victory to objectives.
Yes, and with objectives, obviously we need to know what the objectives of the Lord are, but I particularly found it interesting to look at the objectives of the enemy, where one of the things that he hates the most is to see the children of the king full of faith, full of triumph, even when they are facing deep crisis, deep trouble, deep pain, when they are declaring that faith, when they're singing it out loud, when they're sounding the trumpet in a spiritual sense. This is something that he cannot stand because for him, he can sense through that. He already can sense his ultimate defeat. So we need to have as one of our objectives, simply to be walking in praise, in faith-filled triumph as we go forward. That is a victory. That is already part of the victory for us.
I see it as sort of a parallel to put on the whole armor of God and then resist the devil and he will flee from you. So even just the putting on of the armor is a source of him fleeing from us. And he doesn't like to retreat, and he hates us and hates everything we stand for. So you go from objectives to enemies.
Now with enemies, I think it's very important to know your enemy. In this situation, we know that the devil and his angelic hosts, they are our ultimate enemies. They are the ones that we really are up against. Now, in the current environment, it can be very easy, and understandably so, to look at human beings, those that are under the dominion of the enemy, those that are acting according to his will, that are even attacking us, that are even looking forward to with glee at the thought of how they would be able to use the current situation in order to attack churches and to attack believers. It's very easy to look at those human beings and identify them as the enemy. But we need to really keep clear in our minds, we need to keep it clear that they are not ultimately our enemy. They are potential friends if the Lord would change their hearts as well. And our real battle is against the spiritual principalities and not flesh and blood, as tempting as it may be to view it the other way around.
So do you think that that's a liberating thing for the people when we realize that our enemy is not made up of human beings, but the forces that might be influencing them? How does that affect us?
Well, I think it really does liberate us, because then we can understand on the spiritual realm that ultimately it's God versus the enemy, or the true enemy, the devil, and the devil is no match for God, obviously. Now, if it's us against human beings, one of the things that will happen is that we will begin to fear them greatly, because obviously those who do not believe are more than those that do believe. And that can be a very frightening thought, just to think if that's all there is to it, just this interhuman warfare. Second of all, it can also fill us with joy at the thought that some of these people that God has put in front of me who would love just simply to curse me and attack me, I may be able to reach them. I may be able to reach them and tell them of the love of God, and that may actually change things on the ground. That may be actually part of the victory as well.
That's wonderful. Love that. Okay, then from enemies, you went to surprise, and I was surprised by this heading in your blog, surprise, and I thought, this is masterful, wonderful. Tell us about that.
Well, to be honest, I have to give credit. I believe it's to an ancient Chinese warrior who formulated some principles of warfare. You can look it up online and find it almost anywhere. But I thought about, this element of surprise. Where do we apply it in the spiritual realm? And I feel that one of the greatest places for that to be applied is in the realm of loving our enemies. The spiritual world goes into shock when we instead of cursing back to those that are cursing us, that are attacking us, we show them love. We proactively go and find them and minister to them. That is something that the spiritual world can hardly handle. There's a story told of, I believe it was the Italians in World War I, that they began surrendering to the enemy, that had just a small number of enemy forces had come behind the lines. And because they were so shocked by the daringness, they didn't even stop to think that it might just be a small group of soldiers here, and we don't need to actually surrender. We can fight them. No, they actually started surrendering. And I think that that is what can happen in our current situation, where if we have that daring faith to go behind the enemy lines, to love those that are persecuting us, that are cursing us, that hate us, there are few things that the devil hates more than seeing some of his own soldiers desert to the ranks of the King Jesus, of course. And I think that we are being handed, that connects to the whole issue of enemies as well, defining our enemies. I think we are being handed a beautiful opportunity in these times, in the fog of war, to go behind enemy lines and share the love of God with those people.
I love that. That's a perspective I think we all need to have. We need to look at the Lord and say, Lord, how is all this going to be used for your kingdom? How do you want to use me in the kingdom? This doesn't stop your power, these things that are going on. So you went from surprise to vengeance. So we got victory, objectives, enemies, surprise, and then vengeance.
Vengeance is something that often, as Christians, we shy a little bit away from that. We know that God does take vengeance, does take revenge, that is. And one thing that we often forget, that in war, there are very many cases when the two sides will trade blame. Like, no, he crossed the border, therefore now it is our job to retaliate, to take action, to avenge what has already been done. And the same applies on the spiritual realm, believe it or not. I actually, this point really became clear to me about a week ago. I was on my way home from a meeting during which I realized that I was really under a very strong spiritual attack, one of the strongest ones that I've perhaps experienced in recent years. And I was on my way home, and on that ride home, I sensed the Lord saying to me, they started it, and I'm going to use it in order to justify my retaliation, to go deeper into enemy territory than otherwise would have been possible. Not that anything's impossible with God, but in that sense. So it was just a beautiful picture that he gave me of, I will use this to wage a retaliatory incursion on enemy territory.
So what can look like a defeat or a setback for us could actually be an opportunity for the Lord to go further than we thought he might.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, that's great. The next one is roll, R-O-L-E, not R-O-L-L, roll. So you got victory, objectives, enemies, surprise, vengeance, roll.
And there we find that the question of our role in this battle can be a very great and even troubling question for many of us. There's what's called the fog of war. In a real war, the soldiers generally don't really know, or at least it used to be that way before technology advanced so greatly, but the soldiers don't really know what's going on over the next hill or in the next village. And you're just in a lonely position, perhaps, waging the battle. It seems like you're on your own. You have these orders from your commander of what to do. It may not even make sense, where you're going and what you're doing. You may have thought that war, or wished that your role in the battle would have been glamorous and glorious. Well, let's just stop for a moment and think. Perhaps God has put me in this supposedly lonely corner, and nobody may be able to see what I'm even doing here right now. I may not even have an idea of what I'm doing here, hardly. But if I'm faithful to what God has called me to do, then my story may be told in a Hebrews 11 hall of faith kind of way someday, because of my simple trust and faithfulness in that corner of the battle lines.
We don't have to do it all. We have to only do our part. We find out from our Lord Jesus what he wants us to do, and then we do that, and that matters. Like the supply sergeant, for example, in a battalion, he's supplying he's not going to pull a trigger, he's not going to fire a rocket, but his role is as important as anybody else's role.
Exactly. And sometimes we can have like I said, we're looking for a more glorious or glamorous role that everybody can see. Well, I'm reminded of a story of a revival in Wales back in the early 1900s, in which one of the triggers, there was a prayer meeting that had been called, and when they really felt that the Lord moved in that prayer meeting was when one timid young lady simply rose up and with tears and timid voice just simply said, "I love Jesus with all my heart." I believe that's the correct quote there. And it just poured out. The floodgates were open for those people in that room. And we don't know, what the simple little things that God has called us to do, and that we sense the urge to do it. We don't know how that could affect and even cause a tidal wave change in some little part of the front lines.
Mm-hmm. Another liberating thought. Okay, the next one is expectations. So you've got role and now expectations.
Well, this one is particularly pertinent and relevant for those of us that have grown up in a Western-style society of ease and affluence, freedom, all these different things that we have taken for granted. We can hardly imagine them being gone. But when you enlist anyhow, even if you're from a Western-style society, you lose a lot of rights right there, or a lot of the expectations you had of life have to be drastically changed. And I think that for our own mental and emotional and spiritual well-being, we're going to have to start taking an approach of, okay, this is war. I cannot expect to have all the privileges and all the perks that I once had in my civilian life, especially in the Western-style civilian life. That is something that we really need to come to terms with in those of us that grew up in a Western-style society. And we also need to start adjusting our expectations so that the little things of life will engage us, will cause us joy. Just those very small things of hearing from a friend who cares about us, of gazing on a sunrise or a sunset. Those things that God is giving us, even though many things are taken away, they need to be giving us those little day-by-day joys, even though our expectations overall need to be lowered.
So we may not have as much stuff, but we still have plenty to be appreciative of. I like the first sentence you gave in that particular point in your blog. Now that you have enlisted, your days as a civilian are over. I thought that was so blunt and so to the point. Thanks for that.
And that's exactly the situation we're involved with right now. In this world today, the days of civilian Christians are over. That is over.
And then the last of your 8 instructions or 8 points of warfare is the word identity. So you got role, then expectations, and then identity.
Well, those of us that enjoy watching like World War I or II documentaries or dramas, you see all these meaningless losses. Just people that they don't even know what they're doing there, why they're there, have no connection with the cause hardly, or have lost connection with the cause. And they're lost, and then they're maybe buried in some mass grave, and nobody even knows where they are. And the thing that we need to remember in a war is that there are casualties. There are very difficult times. There are people that go and don't come back. And that could start happening for believers across the world, even in a physical way. But the difference is that the King knows exactly where we fell, and he immediately from that point ushers us into his presence. We are not mere cannon fodder that just is simply tossed out in order to make some meaningless gain of a few meters or yards. No, we are sons and daughters of the King, of the commander himself, and he takes that personal interest in us, with that being our identity.
Mm-hmm. Besides all of that, and that's wonderful, is the fact that when Jesus died at Calvary, he destroyed the one who had the power of death so that he could deliver those who through fear of death were subject to bondage their entire lives. And so now we're in war. We're not in bondage to the fear of death any longer, so we go into war no matter what the outcome might be.
Absolutely. We have been liberated from that. So when you have nothing to lose, when death, the sting of death has been removed, and you have nothing to lose on that end, then that does liberate us to do the valiant deeds that the Lord wants us to do at this time.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's time to take a quick 20-second break. You're listening to a conversation with blogger Jeremy on the subject of the spiritual war that true believers are engaged in right now in our world, worldwide. We'll be back soon.
You've been listening to Strength for Today's Pastor. Foyman Ministries appreciates your participation in prayers. If you'd like to help financially support this podcast, you can go to our website at foymanministries.com/donate. Thank you.
Okay, we're back with blogger Jeremy. Jeremy, you started with victory in your 8 points, and I so appreciated that. It reminded me of something I think about a lot, that I should live my life backwards if I can. That is, I live my life from its end back to where I am now. What do I want written on my gravestone about the focus of my life? And the end game of your article seems to be victory. That's what we have. We have it now, and we're going to have it for all eternity. So maybe you could talk about that and why it's so important to begin with victory. I know you referred to it briefly before, but maybe as we engage with the enemy, how important that is.
Well, that is such an important point, because when we are approaching this battle from a standpoint of victory, from an overwhelming standpoint of power in that victory, it helps us move forward with boldness. It helps us know that whatever we do, whatever we are called to do, and whatever price we are called to pay, that this is part of the ultimate victory of Christ in this world. And I think it's something that gives us a lot of confidence. I think it's something that removes or alleviates the fear that so many of us can so naturally be feeling in the current worldwide situation, where it really does feel like everything is out of our control. It feels like the forces of evil are raising their heads and seem to have the upper hand. But that is actually an illusion. That is not the true outcome. That's what the devil would want us to believe. He would want it to paralyze us into believing that so that he could take us captive in the meantime. But ultimately, that is not the true outcome.
Well, you live in Israel. We've been able to disclose that fact. And around you, you have all kinds of different dynamics going on. You've got countries, you've got potential peace accords, you've got terrorist organizations, all kinds of stuff going on there in Israel. And the result is, of course, that there are a lot of tactics being employed by a lot of different sides. What do you think the tactics of the enemy are right now against his people? From your perspective, being, close to potentially tense situations, what do you think the tactics of the enemy are against the church right now, and how should we defend ourselves?
Well, I think the tactics are very similar the world over. And I think what we see I'm specifically speaking of the Western world right now, and even more specifically speaking of what's going on in America, I think that we see that there's an attempt to paralyze. That attempt to paralyze comes through just an overwhelming amount of conflicting information. And that can just be that can cause a great deal of confusion when you're just trying to sort through all that. So that's an attempt to paralyze. Within that, there's also an attempt to bring guilt. What we've seen through the last few months, that there's an incredible attempt to bring guilt just for being, just for moving around. There's a lot of things like that. I'm not commenting specifically on what should or shouldn't be done right at the moment. I'm just saying the spirit that seems to be behind a lot of it is a spirit of inducing guilt in people. And not only confusion, and there's also a sense of just simply a loss of knowing what is going on, just a loss of having any clear indication of what actually the truth is about any given subject. So I think those are the tactics. I think part of it is in order to distract us, in order to get us so bogged down in trying to figure those things out that we won't be actually carrying out the orders that we have been given. Definitely psychological warfare going on there.
So that connects directly with the heading of role in your blog, because that's what we need to focus on. So the paralysis isn't necessary. We don't have to be paralyzed by the amount of information or disinformation that's out there. We don't have to surrender to guilt. And we certainly don't have to be uncertain, because there is a clarion call from Jesus concerning exactly what we should be doing.
Absolutely. Definitely.
So on those subjects, the paralysis, guilt, uncertainty that you mentioned, understanding the schemes of the devil is important, but then putting on the armor of God is important to be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand. These are the things that are necessary. I think that, as a pastor, there are a lot of fears right now and apprehensions about what's going to happen if things do change. Like, for example, if the pandemic simmers down, when that happens, what's going to happen to congregations? What's going to happen to people that have been full of uncertainty, full of fear, full of questions, potentially full of guilt, not really willing to share what they really think about things for fear of recrimination or criticism? What's going to happen when they start coming back together under one roof or under several roofs as believers? Pastors think about this stuff a lot. Any word of advice to pastors on how they can prepare their people to return?
Wow, that's a huge question. I would say that just simply the connection with Jesus, the relationship with Jesus ultimately is what's going to pull us through in this time. And encouraging the flock to individually and collectively build that relationship with Jesus and hear the voice of the shepherd, that will allow the sheep to let their voices be heard as well, instead of being timidly shocked into silence.
So along with that, then, there's the clear marching orders of the church as a whole to fulfill the Great Commission, to preach the gospel to every creature, to make disciples of the nations. So don't you think that if we're really about that, and that's the focus as we all come back together, that we're going to be able to hopefully overlook, the discretions of others, love covers the multitude of sins, that kind of thing, and move forward without these lingering, painful conversations that we may have had with even other believers. I mean, that's a long statement. I'm sorry about that long statement, but there's a lot going on right now.
Well, I think there's a lot going on that field as far as like the divisions that have been caused and whatnot. I think that the place to meet up again is at the feet of Jesus, and I think that will have a healing and reunifying effect on people. People on all sides can be may have been deceived in one way or another in how they viewed different aspects of the situation. So there's always room to come back to the feet of Jesus and allow him to wash us clean and clarify those things, and more importantly, to really build that relationship with him and with those around us who are also in relationship with him.
Amen. I'm thinking also about the role of the pastor. If we're going to be serving as soldiers, and we're giving up our civilian rights, our civilian lives, because we've been called into war, and if we're part of the Great Commission and preaching the gospel, and we're part of the body of Christ, then the pastor's role is to equip the saints for ministry and prepare them for their role in the battle. But also the role of the pastor as a shepherd is to realize, the people that are part of our fellowships, they're really hurting. I mean, this has really been a tough time for them. So to have compassion, empathy, patience, and then for the members of the body themselves with one another, just to make a decision before they even resume normal fellowship relationships. I forgive you, and please, will you forgive me? Even without being asked. I just love you. You're my brother. You're my sister in Christ. We are both worshiping at the feet of Jesus, as you put it. I think that could help too.
Absolutely. I think that giving a personal example in that is obviously helpful, and also simply a calm voice of confidence is very much needed in each setting, where there's that confidence in what God is doing in spite of the troubles, where in the character of God through these troubles, and also that calmness. Instead of getting carried away with harsh rhetoric in any direction, just a calm voice of confidence can be very, very healing in that kind of a situation.
Well, Jeremy, now I'm going to give you an opportunity. We've sort of summarized the blog that you've written, and it was so good. Now's your opportunity to share anything that's on your heart to share with pastors, because this is primarily a podcast to strengthen pastors, to minister to them. So take a couple of minutes. How can they convert this military attitude into discipleship and equipping of the flock? Whatever you really want to talk about, go for it. You got a couple of minutes, and they're all yours.
Well, when we look at the actions of Jesus in his years of ministry, he spent time with individuals, and he really focused on that discipleship, that personal discipleship. And I think that is a great calling, a great need at this time. People are, after all these months of social distancing and whatnot, to the extent and through the medium that a person is able to, it's good to have that personal connection, that how are you doing, where are the battle lines in your life, what does the Lord want to be doing in your life. So I think that an emphasis on that personal equipping through a very personal empathy and care type of discipleship, that is really important. And I think that a sense of urgency, not panic, but urgency is in order. We really, I living overseas can sense it. Every time that I come back for a visit to the United States, the ship is really sinking there. And it can be very hard for those of us that grew up in the United States to imagine anything other than the world superpower, the greatest economy in history. I I really want to encourage people, not in panic, but in a sense of God-given urgency, to prepare themselves mentally for the distinct possibility that those days are over, they're not coming back. But at the same time, we have these opportunities, that these golden opportunities that God is giving us through the trials, because of the trials, that will bring much fruit and a great harvest into the kingdom.
Yeah, and we're really feeling it here, not just for the pandemic-related issues or some of the extreme political issues that are here, but parts of our country are dealing with hurricanes and tornadoes and severe flooding and fires in California, and it's just amazing. I've never seen anything like it all at once with such incredible proportions. But, the people, we just need to rally together under the banner of Jesus and trust the Lord and come together and help one another. And that's going on too. But boy, there's a lot going on. So I love your comment about the calm leader approach. I think that's so essential because we cannot panic. Well, I really appreciate your sharing with us, Jeremy. It's been great to have you. And I just want to give sort of a little bit of a thing about Blogger Jeremy's posts. They're available at readypen.blogspot.com. That's a-ready-pen.blogspot.com. And all these bits of information will be in the show notes to this podcast. And if you have a comment to make or a question to ask, just send us an email at strongerpastors@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to pass your information or question or comment on to Blogger Jeremy, and he'll get back to you as the Lord allows him to. But thanks for joining us, Jeremy. It's been a pleasure, and it's good to meet you this way.
It's been my pleasure as well.
Thank you. Well, before we go, I'd like to encourage you to visit the podcast page on our website at pointmanministries.com/podcast. Also, as you visit our website, there are a lot of other ways our team can help encourage and strengthen you that you'll discover there as you peruse our website. We'd love to hear your feedback or follow up with any questions you may have. Again, just send us an email at strongerpastors@gmail.com. So from the staff, pastors, and board of directors here at Pointman Ministries, we wish God's very best upon you and your ministry in these days of war. This is war, but the Lord is our captain, and we are assured of victory in the long run. So long until next week.
Strength for Today's Pastor is sponsored by Pointman Ministries. You can find us at pointmanministries.com. That's spelled Poimen ministries.com. If something in today's program prompts a question or comment, or if you have a topic idea for a future episode, just shoot us an email at strongerpastors@gmail.com. That's strongerpastors@gmail.com. May the Lord bless you as you serve Him, His pastors, and His church.